Please take the name of the topic and your introduction.
A very good evening to all ladies and gentlemen. I am Varenivir Singh and I will be speaking for the motion that this House would blacklist tax havens like Panama. Now ladies and gentlemen, before going any further with my arguments, I would first like to clarify what exactly the topic is. Now when we talk of tax havens, what exactly are we talking about? Now tax havens refers to states or countries or territories which maintain financial secrecy, which enables foreign individuals to hide assets or income to avoid or reduce taxes in their home jurisdiction. Now what is a blacklist? Now a blacklist is a list or a register of entities or people for one reason or another who are being denied a particular privilege, service or access or recognition for the very basic reason because they've done something wrong. Now ladies and gentlemen, when today we as side proposition talk about blacklisting tax havens like Panama, we do have a very solid reason behind that. And the very basic reason behind that is because it is affecting the global economic stability. However, we take it as our burden to separate our topic into 6 aspects. Our first aspect will be how we would actually go about the blacklisting and what overall effect would it have in the reduction of tax havens, which will eventually lead to an economic uplift globally. Second is how tax havens promote illegal activities like money laundering and financing terrorism. And third point is how tax havens are inequitable. Our fourth point today will be how tax havens harm the state revenues of the home jurisdiction from which the companies originally belong in the tax havens. Our fifth point is going to be how tax havens give rise to complicated tax regimes. And our sixth would be linking the case of Panama to economic and other effects of tax havens. Now ladies and gentlemen, today I will be touching upon the first 2 points that I have already elaborated. Now when we talk of blacklisting, now how would we go about blacklisting each and every tax haven? Now when we talk of blacklisting a tax haven, we will be doing it in a way in which not only does the country suffer a reduce in its economic stability, but also the companies which went to that country in search for better feeding pastures do also realize their mistake. We are proposing today to put economic sanctions on countries as a method of blacklisting, which are actually providing tax havens, which are actually proving as tax havens for companies so that they can thrive. We are actually today suggesting cutting them off cutting those countries from the global trade market so that actually they can see a reduction in their economic stability. And this, the very basic reason why today we as side proposition are proposing this method of reducing the economic stability of that nation, because those very tax havens, ladies and gentlemen, need to realize that how they have affected the economic stability of many countries by proving to be tax havens. Ladies and gentlemen, not now ma'am. But so ladies and gentlemen, we today as side proposition believe that tax havens have committed a global atrocity and they need to be reminded of the mistake, and it's time they start correcting it.
Point of information.
Okay. My question was, you said that tax havens are affecting the economies of other countries.
Yes ma'am.
But most of these tax havens are small countries and many are only islands. For example, Panama and Havana. They also have to survive. This is their business plan. So what do you propose?
Ma'am, when you talk of surviving using a business plan, so do you suggest to survive, for one country to survive, you suggest that the other country loses its economic stability? According to a report, ladies and gentlemen, when one country actually starts surviving, it actually takes up another nation. A report actually states that if the tax havens are removed, then many countries which are at present in debt and are actually trying to also survive with other nations, actually, not now sir, let me complete my answer, will actually become net profiters if those very companies take their place. Now ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand that today's side opposition came up here and right now question me that how would the other countries survive if the companies are not allowed to live there. We need to understand, talking about survival does not mean you take the wrong step. It's actually what they're suggesting is that just because a person does not have enough money and he's poor, he should actually take the way of robbing something or turning to a thief.
Point of information, sir.
Survive. So today, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Wait, the United States doesn't collect tax interest and capital gains by foreign investors and is therefore can be considered the largest tax haven in the world. Would you stop trade with the United States of America?
So when the need comes, United States of America also has to suffer, and it also has to be punished for the very basic reason, ladies and gentlemen. I might be sounding a bit ridiculous here, but we need to understand, when it comes to a global scale, we are not talking about the United States of America, and United States of America is not the only country that deserves to survive in this world, and United States of America is not the only country that deserves economic stability. Not now, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that when we talk of something in a global aspect, when we talk considering keeping the entire world in mind, we need to talk regarding taking each and every country into regard. Taking countries even like Nigeria into regard, and taking even high countries like United States of America into regard. And if United States of America are committing atrocities, they need to be punished, because each and every wrongdoer has to be punished, and even if it includes blacklisting the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, because we are not afraid to do that. Now, coming to my next point of argument, ladies and gentlemen, how tax havens actually lead to financing terrorism, illegal activities like financing terrorism and money laundering. Now, I don't really understand whether today's side opposition realized it or not, but terrorist organizations like the Islamic State of Iran, ISIS, are actually way better funded than many countries in today's world, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how exactly is that happening is we need to realize, because we need to understand that ISIS cannot solely survive on killing people and blasting around bombs, because they need money for those very things. And where do they get that from? They're not running companies around the world that they're gaining money. The very basic fact that they gain money is through illegal activities like money laundering that are being promoted by these very tax havens. And that is why we today, as side proposition, tell you to blacklist these tax havens so that these illegal activities are actually stopped. We need to understand that today, when we start promoting tax havens, we are actually in a way promoting illegal activities like money laundering and financing terrorism. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a big global threat which needs to be addressed immediately, because we can easily see the effect that ISIS has in Iraq and Syria. And the very basic fact is that ISIS, an organization which started its funding through illegal activities like money laundering, thanks to tax havens, is now actually controlling two very big nations and is now thriving on their economy and eating up their economy to satisfy their selfish interests. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the world is at a loss. So we do not propose, we today here understand that there will be complications in our implementation of plans. There are going to be mistakes. But when we look at the larger picture, when we look at the distant dream that is achieving a universal economic stability, for that tax havens will have to end. For that tax havens will have to be reduced, because until and unless tax havens are not removed, global economic stability cannot be achieved. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I would simply like to say, tax havens are doing nothing but eating up us like parasites. They reside on our host companies. They take advantage for them for their own advantage. But in return, the host countries from where the companies came get nothing. So that parasitic nature has to be removed, because parasites never benefit anyone. With this, I'm very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
The first speaker from the opposition.
In a world where a few countries like the United States of America, like Germany, like France or like the UK got a leg up through oppressive policies all throughout history. In a world where these few developed countries control the entire global economy and make it impossible for other nations to develop, in a world where it's the fault of these nations that other nations are stuck as developing countries and unable to move forward, we believe that it is extremely hypocritical on their side of the house to claim that blacklisting tax havens is a good thing. Now, in my speech today, I'm going to tell you how developed countries are the ones who benefit from this blacklisting, and I'm going to tell you why developed countries are the reason tax havens exist. I'm going to show you how it's absolutely unfair for developed countries to push for tax havens being blacklisted while they maintain their own in other backyards. And I'll be explaining this to you with examples from the UK and the United States themselves. But first, let's look at what they said, or more specifically, what they didn't say. So they gave us a Wikipedia definition of what exactly tax havens are. But we asked them in a point of information, is America a tax haven? Which they didn't deny. So they said, yes, the United States of America, largest economy in the world, we're just going to stop trading with them and see how that ends up. Hopefully, people don't lose their jobs in large scale and go into massive havoc. And furthermore, the point which we were trying to make by that point of information is that tax havens can be anything. Any country that gives a certain level of freedom to people who invest from foreign nations while concealing their records can be considered tax havens. And that's extremely dangerous because they have not defined what they're going to do to these nations. And tax havens have varying degrees. Panama was an extremely big haven, but there are other havens that just aren't as bad. So my question to the proposition is, are you going to stop trading with them all absolutely? Are you not going to have a sliding scale where you decide that country's offense was more severe than another? Because we believe that proportional punishment is essential when you try to take away their rights to trade. Now, I'm going to be moving on to my first argument on how it's unfair for the developing countries to push for tax havens. Next, I'm going to be talking to you about...
So, POI.
No, thank you, sir. I'm going to be talking to you about how it's a legitimate practice to actually keep your money in a tax haven and for developing countries to maintain tax havens. My next speaker is going to be talking to you about the dangers of actually blacklisting tax havens, how it affects developing countries extremely adversely, and how it's not going to help us in the long term. Now, let's see exactly how the countries which have gotten to tax havens got it this way. Most of them are developing countries which really can't do anything else. We have nations like the Virgin Islands which have been colonized for centuries, and as a result their resources have been stripped from them and they have no way of other income. Look at Dubai. If it doesn't adopt itself to a different business strategy, what is it going to do? Does the proposition just propose that these nations starve, that Dubai does not feed its people because it doesn't have oil in its nation? We say that that's absolutely disgusting. We say that when developed countries manage to control trade massively in organizations like the WTO, they don't allow other countries to subsidize their people. They don't allow other countries to develop properly and actually monopolize the global market. We believe that if a country decides to take up a different path to success, it has the right to do so. They told us that development should not come at the cost of other countries. We ask you, what did Germany, what did France, what did Spain, what did the United States of America do to a million nations? Because the United States of America is a prime example of a nation that wants tax havens gone, but actually doesn't realize that it's created most of them with its high taxes, and it's also stripped nations like Iran and in the entire Middle East, in fact, of its ability to grow on its own. We believe that that's the reason tax havens come up, because these developing nations need to come up with some creative way to actually feed their people, because countries like UK and USA don't allow them to do it.
So, point of argument.
Trade. Yes, sir.
So you've been saying that developing nations need to come up with a creative way to actually feed their people because there's no other way. So are you in a way suggesting that just because some person cannot afford to eat food for a day, he starts robbing or committing theft and then justifying it?
Sir, please, no, sir. Thank you, sir. Let me just ask you, what do you think colonization was? Colonization was going into other countries, robbing their food and resources and getting out. We believe that every country over here in the world has made atrocities, but tax havens are the lowest on the list. And that if you're going to go after that, then there's a very large list of every country to persecute. And that point of information does not apply. In fact, I'm not even sure that was a real question. Now, on to my second point today on how it's a legitimate choice to put your money in a tax haven. So now I'm going to be looking at this from the side of the people. Okay, the people who want their money. I mean, in France, in a place like France, 45% of your money gets taken away as income tax. That's nearly half of what you earn through your daily life, and the government just takes it. And if the people at this point of time believe that the government is not using your money wisely, if the people at this point of time believe that when they see a not illegal, totally legal tax avoidance method, not tax evasion, there's a major difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax evasion is absolutely illegal, but tax avoidance is simply storing it in another country, and by international norms and by country laws, it's pretty legal. If people decide that their taxes need to remain with themselves, they have the right to keep it there. And I'm going to tell you what this actually influences developed countries to do. So countries like the United States of America and UK for a long time had massively high taxes. And the people decided to start offshoring their money into tax havens. And this actually had a massive impact on the government. They realized that no longer can we put 4 different layers of income tax to indiscriminately tax our people and just take all their money. And as a result, we've seen in the past 15 years or so, 27% of the tax in developed countries and in certain developing countries where this tax regime is extremely so high has gone down. Which is why we believe that these tax havens have an important indicator as to the people's opinion of what taxes are like over there. We believe that's very important because only then do countries realize that they need to take down the tax which they give their people, and there's no other way for it to happen.
So point of information.
Yes, sir.
So sir, now do you suggest that now the so-called big countries, USA, UK and France, have realized that the tax are very heavy on people and they cannot actually afford to pay it? So now isn't it time for the companies to come back to their host country? Now why should they still survive on tax havens?
Be brief.
Yes, ma'am.
So why do you feel that they should still survive on tax havens?
So, okay, firstly, there has been a 27% decrease, but just because there's been a decrease doesn't mean it's all fine. Just because there's been improvement in certain nations doesn't mean that every single nation is now utopia. We don't believe that's the truth. We believe that tax havens still serve the majority of the purpose of people keeping their money safe. Like celebrities like Emma Watson per se use tax havens like this for privacy because they don't want other people to know where they're buying their house. And we believe that that's an absolutely legitimate
30
reason.
seconds more.
They have an absolutely legitimate reason to not show their money. If it's totally legal and it doesn't harm but actually helps the tax rate in other countries, we believe the tax havens should not be blacklisted in this manner, not be blacklisted in such a way that they indiscriminately abuse developing nations to give them no alternative to develop. We believe developed nations, by pushing for this, are being extremely hypocritical. I mean, look at the United Kingdom. They have a separate area on the Virgin Islands, which is their own, which is their own area of black money. But they won't take that down. Developing nations do not get to dictate international terms.
Okay, thank you. The third speaker from the proposition now. Second, sorry.
I think so. Karthik's my pencil there.
Yeah. Right, so the opposition has come up here and framed this as a debate about developed countries versus developing countries. But that's not exactly what this debate is about. So first, before I get to that, let me make a few points of rebuttal on what the opposition has said. Firstly, they said that developing countries need to be tax havens in order to survive and be thriving economies. But firstly, that's not even true. They have other paths: tourism, trade, service industries. These are all legitimate paths that small island developing states have taken in order to become economically developed, and they didn't need to be tax havens in order to do that. And secondly, they said that it's a legitimate choice to avoid a 45% tax rate, for example, in France, by putting your money in an offshore tax haven. What this firstly doesn't recognize is two things. That a government spends that high tax money on services that this citizen is going to enjoy. Are you saying that this citizen is justified in not wanting to pay the tax but wanting to receive the service instead? And secondly, if they really believe that this tax rate is unjustified, if they really think it's wrong to have a 45% tax rate on their income, they can do what regular people in regular democracies do, and they can lobby the government to change it. That's exactly why we have democratic policy making. That's exactly what you should be using this for. You should be telling the government that we don't want this high tax rate if that's what you really think. Now, they also said that tax evasion is not the same as tax avoidance, but principally they are the same. They are not paying taxes to the government, storing your money somewhere else so that you don't have to do that. The opposition has not given us any reason to consider them separately other than the fact that one is legal and the other is not, which completely ignores the point that we are trying to make both of them illegal because we believe that principally both of them are unjustified. Now, I have three constructive arguments.
Point of information, sir.
Yes.
So you said that tax evasion is the same as tax avoidance, right? So do you know that tax avoidance, which is equal to tax planning, is very legal
Just
in
a
your own
question,
country?
please.
Just comment on this.
So what I'm saying is that tax avoidance, in the form of not willing to, trying to set up in such a way that you don't have to pay taxes to a country based on business in. No, thank you, sir. It's principally unjustified. That's exactly what the proposition case is. Now, I have three constructive arguments to make.
Firstly, that tax avoidance reduces the state revenues of the host countries that they do business in. Secondly, that in the long run, it is harmful for businesses. And thirdly, that tax havens are structurally inequitable. Now, my first point, that state revenues are actually reduced when you have tax havens. And when you have state revenues being reduced, of course, as a consequence of having state revenues reduced, you're going to have less spending on social services, less spending on infrastructure, maybe a greater national debt. So, of course, it's a negative outcome, and we on proposition, we want to avoid this outcome by abolishing tax havens. Right? So, let's see how this is actually going to reduce the state revenue. When you have big companies, and this goes principally, it is large companies that use these tax havens in order to avoid taxes. When you have these big companies shifting to avoid taxes, the amount of tax that they do not pay is significant. The amount of tax that is not being paid to the state is actually a significant amount that would be used if given to the state for many extremely justified things such as social services and infrastructure. And when you don't have that, you're actually having a one-way flow of money, because the companies, they get immense profit from doing business in these countries, but they don't want to pay taxes in these countries. And we find this on proposition to be unfair, because on our side, we ensure that companies, they do businesses in regular countries. They ensure that the revenues of these regular countries increase and that everyone benefits from this flow of business. But on their side, they want to allow companies to keep removing money from the country without paying taxes for it and without justifying that flow of money. Now, onto my second
Point of information?
Yes.
Yeah, you said that the state, you kept going on how the state revenues would be reduced. But like earlier, in the early years, the taxes were so high that you actually paid more to the government than you got to keep to yourself. So how is that a good thing?
As I said before, if you find the tax policy of the country is unjustified, you can shift it to another country which has a reasonable tax rate. That is, tax havens having little to no taxes and no financial transparency are very different from regular countries that do businesses with varying levels of tax. Some of them have extremely high taxes, some of them have more moderate levels of taxation. And if you think that you really don't want to bear with that high level of taxation, you can always shift to do business in another country. But then that also doesn't change the fact that if you really have a problem with that high rate of taxation, you can always lobby the government to change it. And in fact, corporate lobbies are so powerful that I don't see why it should be a problem for corporations to lobby government to say, no, we don't want this high tax. We don't want to pay so much tax. We can't actually create jobs and do good business in this country if you make us pay these high taxes. And that's why we don't see such high taxes in that many countries anymore. If you go to Scandinavian countries, they are of course the exception and not the norm. Tax rates in general are not so high that businesses are unable to operate as a result of them.
Point of information, sir.
No, thank you, sir. On to my second constructive argument, that tax havens are structurally inequitable. That is, they only benefit the rich and they harm the poor. They benefit the rich, they harm the poor, not just the poor people, the everyday common man, but also small and medium enterprises, other businesses that can't afford to take on these tax havens. Let's see how this is true. Because only big businesses can actually afford to set up shop in a foreign country like a tax haven and afford to set up base in this country. And this means that small and medium enterprises cannot actually afford to do the same thing. That means that it's only the rich companies that are avoiding taxes, while regular, hardworking and entrepreneurial businesses are not actually given the chance to pay. They have to pay full dime on their taxes. They aren't even allowed the same privilege as given to richer and bigger companies. And even tax avoidance itself is generally done by rich businesses, job creators who get a free pass because they are seen as essential to the economy. And we find this on proposition to be extremely unjust. Because only we on proposition, we try to end this unjust and inequitable practice, and we try to ensure that the rich can't get out of paying their fair share. The opposition would rather let this practice persist, let rich companies continue to pay less than both the average man and other smaller companies. And that's why we have an extremely principled problem with their stance. And to my third argument, and this is one of the most critical arguments, because when you say that, my argument is that tax havens in the long run are actually harmful for businesses themselves. And this is a crucial point, because the most cases for having tax havens rest on the claims that businesses need them in order to be profitable. I'm going to show you how that's not actually true and how tax havens harm businesses in the long run. As I already pointed out, tax havens are inequitable. That is, rich companies get away with tax avoidance, while the poor companies and while average companies and poor people cannot. So let's analyze the consequences of this. Firstly, it's going to lead to populist anger against these big companies. It's going to make people think, the average Joe is going to feel screwed over, and he's going to find a lot of other average Joes who also feel screwed over, and then they start a movement like Occupy Wall Street. And what is the consequence of this anger? An anti-business sort of environment is created. That means that businesses find it harder and harder to operate in that country. They may even just move out for legitimate reasons, that they find it extremely hard to do business in this country this time. And this will actually harm the economic prospects of the country in the long term, and thus in the end, nobody is made better off. And it all started when you had that tax haven. So what have I told you today? I've told you that tax avoidance reduces state revenues of the host countries for these companies. Secondly, that they are structurally inequitable and that they benefit only the rich while the poor and medium enterprises are not made better off. And thirdly, that tax havens in the long run are not even beneficial to the businesses
30 seconds.
and to the economy in the long run. That's why we are extremely proud to propose.
The second speaker from the
So, good evening. My name is Anandita. I love argument. I love debate. I don't expect anyone just to sit there and agree with me. That's not their job. Yes, I am quoting the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, because we need that kind of steely resolve to debate the topic. The House would blacklist tax havens like Panama. Now, cutting straight to the chase. The nearest and most important tax haven for India is Mauritius. 2 days back, we said that India will take the tax capital market gain from Mauritius. People invest in India through participatory notes, or more commonly known in stock market terms as P notes. Do you realize how many P notes come to India from Mauritius? Around 30% of P notes come from Mauritius, which also happens to be our nearest tax haven. If we tax these havens, which is as good as blacklisting them, what will happen to these P notes? The money which otherwise would have come to India will now go to Brazil or Russia, which results in a major loss of trade and stocks for the country. Suppose we are blacklisting these on a totally global scale.
Point of information.
I'll be taking those later. Do you think that the money won't go anywhere? It will go in the wrong hands. Money which cannot be used in the right means will end up in the grey market, where anyone can just tap into that and use it for their own greedy means. This money in the grey market will be used for the wrong means to make more money for themselves. For example, when United States of America put a blacklist on Iran, what did Iran do? Very simple. They entered into an agreement with India to take the fuel money in rupees. It was a win-win situation for everyone, except perhaps the United States of America. In the same way, if we abolish these tax havens, they will just find another route to deploy their money. There are around 40 tax havens in the world. That's not the exact amount, I'm just giving a rough figure. So if we abolish these entirely, if we blacklist them, then trade in the world will go down drastically. All countries dependent on trade for their primary income would have absolutely no source. The money would go down, revenue would go down, there would be absolutely no trade. That country's development would also eventually reduce. And most of these tax havens are all very tiny and small, and most are only islands like Panama and Havana. They have to survive, and this is the main source of revenue for them. This is the business strategy that they have to adopt to survive.
Points of information?
I'll be taking those later, please. It's simply a matter of survival in this mean world. And furthermore, as of now, tax havens are completely legal. So anything legal is not considered as robbing. And also, because of these tax havens, other countries are forced to reduce their revenues, which was pointed out by the second speaker of the proposition. I would also like to highlight the fact that in 1960, we're not talking about decades and decades ago, just around 40 to 50 years, India's tax rate was 97%. Who would want to invest in India? Moreover that, who would want to live there? you are 100 rupees, you give 97 rupees to the government, what will you live on? All you have is 3 rupees. 3 rupees to clothe yourself, 3 rupees to pay rent for your houses, 3 rupees to feed yourself. How can you survive? And these tax havens, we feel, is the least messiest, legal and fastest way to reduce the revenue of the government, which is to say, the tax rates. We would also like to stress...
Ma'am, point of information on that.
Okay, fine.
So ma'am, in a way, what you are saying is that we actually want the government that if you do not reduce the revenue, we won't indeed take all the benefits from your government, but we won't pay your tax, we'll go to some other country and pay their tax. So ma'am, what you're actually promoting is disharmony in the very nation itself.
No, what I'm saying is that the tax rate would be reduced. There are still a lot of people living here, right? And the tax rate has not gone so drastically. So there's still money left for the government for the welfare of its people. Now continuing with my point.
Point information on that.
I'll be taking this later again. Yeah. Tax havens are not necessarily bad. In developing countries of Africa, who would want to go and invest there? Conflict after conflict, everyone is just completely lost on what to do. So tax
Points of
havens.
information.
Let me complete my point, please. They are completely confused as to what to do. And if tax havens are put there, then money which comes many a times is used to build infrastructure like roads, buildings, etc., which helps in development of the countries. Yes, please. Now I'll be continuing with my debate.
No ma'am, I do have a point.
I'll be continuing with my debate, unfortunately. What is required is not blacklisting tax havens, but regulating them. Now, there are a few ways in which tax havens can be regulated. They do not need to disclose the name of the shareholders, which most of them are following now. And you can enter into an agreement with tax havens called multilateral agreement, which also helps drastically in regulating them. Another thing which would help in regulating tax havens is accounting for.
Point of information.
Okay.
So you quoted the example of India having a 97% tax rate. If you think
Yes.
that's a problem, then don't you think that people and companies can just lobby to lower the tax rate like they do in democracies?
How much time would that take? There's also corruption. Everything can go two ways. It's a two-sided coin. You may start with the right intentions, but you never know what the people in the scheming governmental politics are going to do. You're not sure what is going to happen, and tax havens have showed that they can reduce them. They're not even, in fact, it has happened so drastically.
Point of information on that.
I'll be continuing with my debate. Offshore investing is often demonized. Investors are painted as scheming villains. Vast majority of offshore deals are actually perfectly legal. Now I'll give an example of why people actually prefer investing in tax havens rather than they would do in other countries. Now there was a company called Nandi Infrastructure which is owned by Ashok Keni from Karnataka. He wanted to do something good for his country. He started off with the correct intentions and he set up his country in Karnataka. Now everyone thought he was a scheming villain. They demonized his investment completely. They told him that you're not doing anything for the welfare of the society. You're just taking our money and eating it away. We will not support you. They made life hell for him. The person who started with good intentions to improve our life, in fact, was left thinking, why did I even do this?
30
Why
seconds.
didn't I go to a tax haven? Now, high-profile investors don't like the public knowing High-profile investors don't like the public knowing when they are investing in such things. So offshore havens ensures in keeping the confidentiality. It also helps to diversify investments, and regulations restrict investment opportunities of citizens. Such restriction under a truly divergent investment portfolio can be beneficial.
Time up, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm just ending. Offshore accounts are also flexible and give investors access to international markets and major exchanges, which results in a divergent
Time
market.
up.
This is why we oppose to blacklist tax havens. Thank you.
And I'm going to be the third speaker of the propositions team, stating again why we should blacklist these tax havens such as Panama. Now, I'd like to state it that it's 45% of the 45% of taxes are paid by citizens in developed countries, and so they go to tax havens. Well, it's not the citizens that are going to the tax havens, it's in fact the corporate companies. It's the corporate companies that already have the money, to pay those taxes, that are going to the tax havens and thus not paying their taxes. This means that the companies that should be paying their taxes, and because they have a duty towards their citizens, they have a duty towards the people they're employing to pay taxes and thus make their lives better. They're escaping from those taxes, and thus the rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. And I'd like to also rebuttal the point made by the first speaker again about privacy, and how privacy is such a necessity, and how people need to be able to keep private all of their sanctions and stuff that they do with their money. Well, if we allow people to be so private with their money, if we allow people to not tell the world what they're doing with their money, how do we know that there's not money laundering happening? How do we know that terrorism is not being funded? How do we know that illegal activities are not taking place? And how are we going to be able to regulate it? Privacy is all right, but there's a line between just keeping some things to yourself and going out there and saying, no, I'm not going to show you anything. There's a line between that. And now, another point that I'd like to come to is that the second speaker talked about how it's the main way in which certain countries, for example, South Africa, can survive. Just because you're poor, and again, the opposition is failing to understand what we're saying, and they're not even addressing this point that we make. Just because you're poor doesn't make it legitimate that you can rob people. Doesn't mean that you can evoke in crime just to get your money. You can't do that. There's a certain ethic that people and countries need to follow. Now let's talk about a case study about Panama itself. The Pascal Saint-Amans, the tax chief of OECD, said that Panama has extremely aggressive and obstructive attitude. Dialogue has broken down. It is the last financial center that has refused to implement global standards of financial transparency. There has been very strong pressure from the tax firms on the Panaman government.
Point of information, ma'am.
Yes, please.
By global standards, do you truly mean the globe or the WTO majority of the nations that get to boss around the world and maintain its terms everywhere?
No, when we talk about global standards, they themselves said that the bossy countries tend to be tax havens. So when we talk about global standards and global pressures, we mean that as a globe, we have this agreement that we need to be transparent with our financial spending. We need to show other countries what we're spending on, because that's what's going to help the global economy grow. And by keeping your taxes not transparent, that can lead to plenty, not now please, that can lead to plenty of illegal activity. Now another point that we have to address is flocking. When, again quoting the OECD, the majority of undeclared clients are coming clean in other locations, but those who aren't are going to Panama. This means that the flocking of companies is happening. Again, reinstating the point of my second speaker, stating that these companies that have a duty towards their countries are just escaping. They're taking the easy route out and going to these countries like Panama, where they're able to just hide their resources. The money is literally going on a one-way stream down to those countries. Now, another thing we need to address is that tax havens are basically fostering corporate greed. Corporate greed is something that we need to deal with. In a country like, for example, Switzerland, which is extremely stable and a developed country and thus is economically stable, nearly 10% of its people are under the poverty line. Now, that may seem like a small figure, but when you think not now please, when you think of an extremely developed country, an economically stable country like Switzerland, you need to understand that 10% under the poverty line, international poverty line, is a huge figure. And what does this mean? It's the rich people that have the money in Switzerland. That's why the country seems rich. The poor people are still going to be poor, and it's because the rich people aren't giving taxes in order to spend on the poor people.
Point of information?
Yes.
Yeah, you spoke about corporate greed. increasing when you don't blacklist these. But if you blacklist all these tax havens, everything goes into a grey market, which just increases corporate greed. They just make more and more money off that market. So what do you have to say to
we're
that?
going to be addressing that point later as well, because our first speaker as well stated about the concept of blacklisting. Basically, when you blacklist a country, you're cutting it off from the World Trade Organization. And just like the opposition was saying how tax havens make people realize they need to reduce taxes, blacklisting the country will make people realize, look, we shouldn't put in tax havens. We need to amend these things that we've done wrong. So again, it's a
Point
thing
of
of
information.
realization, not now, please. And then we need to talk about normal citizens. And I've reinstated this point again and again. Normal citizens are the people that are being harmed by this whole idea of tax havens. It's the citizens that work day and night and they pay their taxes. It's the citizens that are making up the country. But these one or two corporate companies are the ones that are taking all the money off the citizens because they put up their prices so high on the market, and then they go and invest in these tax havens. They go put their bases in these tax havens. So money is being taken from the poor and given to the rich. Again and again, I can't reinstate this fact further, but tax havens are doing nothing but funding the rich. And when we talk about the Panama Papers, 11.5 million documents were released by a company called Mossack Fonseca, excuse my pronunciation, but these documents showed that collusion and corporate espionage and stuff like that were happening in these tax havens like Panama. It was showing the incredible numbers of illegal activities that were happening in these tax havens like Panama. Basically, the opposition today is helping illegal activity. They're saying, yes, illegal activity should continue, because you know what, it's happening anyway. It's going to be too difficult to take out. Yeah?
Ma'am, could you tell the House how tax havens are an illegal practice?
Yeah, so when tax havens are when a company invests in tax havens, it means that they have full privacy to their financial spendings and the way they use their money. This means that they don't have to keep this money. They don't, because it's not transparent. It doesn't necessarily have to be good. They can take place in collusion. They can go for espionage. They can go for money laundering. They go for terrorism, and no one's going to stop them because no one knows about it. It's just like putting a blindfold on all the other nations that are working hard to earn their money. Their citizens are working hard to earn their money. So I'd like to conclude that the opposition is basically saying that because tax havens are good, they're saying that illegal activity is okay as long as it helps the country to survive. And we're saying no, because we have to be fair to the economy. We can't let the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we have to maintain our economic system. Thank you.
Kindly introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name is Arjun Shukla, and I'm proudly opposing the said motion. I'll be starting my debate by telling you what the motion is and what the key points in the motion are, which have been completely ignored by the proposition today. The motion reads that this House would blacklist tax havens like Panama. Let me tell you, blacklist equals banning, and tax havens is a jurisdiction where particular taxes, say your income taxes, your inheritance taxes, are levied at a low rate or not at all. So coming to my rebuttals today, which are loads because of the points made by the proposition, the first speaker, I believe, came up and said that in reply to the opposition team saying that USA is in fact the biggest tax haven in the world, the Prime Minister came up and said that fair enough, we'll put economic sanctions on the US and we will just stop trade with them. And in defense of this, he actually said that how tax havens lead to economic instability across the globe. Sir, do you understand how stopping trade with the most powerful country in the world, placing an economic sanction on the most powerful country in the globe would lead to economic instability? Also, the deputy...
So point information on that.
Denied. Deputy Prime Minister, I believe, said that tax evasion is equal to tax avoidance, which is not true. Tax avoidance is tax planning, which in fact is completely legal in this country, in India as well. And so the proposition team has come up and said that the funds gotten through tax havens are used for funding ISIS, is used for all sort of illegal activities. What they don't understand is that this money is used for developing these less developed nations, for developing their infrastructure, providing more employment to the people of these developing nations. So what Team Proposition has come here and said is that tax haven is really bad, but they've not told us how, and they're all superficial statements without any backing. Their burden today was to prove to the House why tax havens are illegal, and their continued practice is detrimental to society. The global society, which they have failed to do. Also, the third speaker thinks that tax haven equals robbing. All right, fair enough. Profit maximization is an accepted and recognized business practice being followed across the world. So, I do not understand why a company would not take all possible measures to do this. Coming on to my constructives now, the first point being that tax havens are not the problem. The problem is with the non-accountability of these tax havens. Tax havens are a capital inflow for development of these less developed nations. These help these smaller and less powerful countries of the world have some market standing in this globe. For example, let's take an example here of Guam. What they did was they lowered their taxes in their country, which led to more people coming into this country, which increased job opportunities in Guam. Blacklisting this would stop all kind of cash inflow to this country and thus restrict their development to whatever capital they may have. What the opposition would also like to argue is that how tax havens are at par with SEZs, which are at par with special economic zones. What are SEZs there for? They're for attracting more FDI into your country, which increases your infrastructure, completely accepted, legal and recognized practice in this very own country. So let me give you an example of what tax planning is. Suppose I'm a family of two, me and my wife. If I show them that I am paying rent to my wife to live in my residence, this is called tax planning, because that way I don't have to pay my house rent. And this is an accepted this is an accepted practice which is going on in your country, in our country and across the world. India is not the only country which practices tax planning or makes it legal. The entire globe at large makes tax planning legal.
So point of information on that.
Yes.
So, sir, in a way you're suggesting that tax planning, which is actually accepted throughout the globe, is in a way bluffing the government so that you do not have to pay the government what it deserves, and then you ask the government to give all the rights that you want.
I didn't see a question here, but I'll try to answer him in whatever capacity I may be able to do so. Understand that tax planning is not only accepted, it's completely legal. And this being legal, sorry. This being completely legal does not mean you're hiding money from your government or you're not giving the government what it deserves. If it were so, the government would simply make it illegal in its powers given to the government. Let me stress on how important tax havens are for smaller and less developed countries. Denied, sir. How important tax havens exactly are for less developed nations of the world. Building on my example of Guam, I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this house would not even have heard of Guam as a country, if I'm not wrong. This is a source of funding for a country like Guam. It is a source which provides education to the people of Guam. It is a source of funds which provides infrastructure like bridges, like schools, your hotels, everything. This is where they get their money from. And if you stop this, where do they get their money from? On this huge world map, Guam, a small country in one corner of the world, how does it exist? How does it survive? Another example given by one of my team members was that of Dubai. Dubai, like many other Middle Eastern countries, primarily depend on exporting oil, and their secondary business practices is this tax havens. If you take away these said tax havens, you're making a country dependent on one practice, which is, in this case, trading of oil, which is not healthy for any country in the world. So, summing up, what the proposition had to come up here and say is why tax havens are illegal, which they have failed to do. So they just come up and said that tax havens are illegal without any backing, without any proof to the House as to why they are illegal. And they had to tell us how continued practice is detrimental to society, to the global society, which they again have failed to do so. What our burden was what the opposition's burden was
30
to tell
seconds
you,
more.
just wrapping up, ma'am. What the opposition's burden was to tell you that tax havens are not illegal. They're very much legal. How they have a positive impact on society and a positive impact on these lesser developed countries of the world. And this is why the opposition is winning this debate. Proud to oppose. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, today let's look at what's been said by both sides of the House. Now let's start off with opposition. Frankly, we've said that there are no alternatives for these other nations, and the response we heard to that was deafening silence. We've said that developed nations maintain their own tax havens and showed you that these tax havens are very unlikely to be taken down. Of course, the Virgin Islands, which the Britain controls, is very unlikely to be put on this blacklist because of the massive amount of bargaining power which the UK has. Once again, deafening silence. Absolutely no rebuttal to that. We've told you what was obscenely wrong with their model, simply because it massively affects the world economy. I mean, in their model, the United States of America is out. The UK is out. The Virgin Islands is out. Most small African continents, nations in that continent are out. Now, the Arabian nations are out. China and Russia are probably out because they're extremely secretive about the things. We ask you, ladies and gentlemen, who's left? Who's left to trade with this policy which they're trying to bring up? Now, we gave you a counter solution. We told you the way we can actually make sure we respect the rights of everyone in this way, and that is by regulation instead of a blanket carpet ban. We told you that it's better simply because it doesn't destroy the lives of millions and the probability that these havens can actually succeed in the future. It's better simply because it recognizes the needs of these nations to develop in whichever way they can. However, it mitigates the risks which they mentioned all throughout their speeches. And most importantly, it's better because it doesn't pander to a monopolized dictatorship by the first world, which is what exists right now, which is what they are suggesting in their side of the house, and we do not stand for that. Now, another thing which they absolutely did not touch was tax reduction. And we've given you analysis and statistics on how tax havens have actively contributed to irresponsible taxes being reduced. All they did was come up here and say, listen, now it might have worked, but there are better ways to do it. We say that they work. It's an actual way which we know works to drive down the price of the taxes, and they haven't contested that whatsoever. So they've accepted that tax havens do in fact have a positive benefit on several nations, and that's a concession which they've made on their side. Now, speaking of their side, let's look at what they've told us. Now, from the get-go, their first 2 minutes essentially establishes how they're going to destroy global trade and put us back into the dark ages. Now, we're fine with that. Next, they told us that they're going to punish everyone equally. Absolutely no decision on how much of a tax haven you are, but you just get absolutely cut from the global economy. So anyone who's hiding any information, obviously the blacklist will be compiled by the WTO and the USA and the UK of the world. They get to cut out anyone they want. And that's their model. That's a situation which they actually like. Then they told us that it's a crime for tax havens to keep this policy. Now, they did not analyze, they did not try to rebut my entire argument on how they have no alternatives. They told us tourism. First off, not every single tax haven is an exotic beach vacation place which you can go to. And second off, tourism is just not possible for every nation as a profitable way to make sure that they succeed in the world. Just look at Dubai, they have no resources. While tourism might give them a little, it's not going to make sure that they survive in the world. And certainly tax haven is a better option for it. And they did not justify how the WTO enforcing this rule is going to make it any better. In their model, they haven't shown us how it's going to be fair. And they haven't shown us how countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, which largely play by their own rules in the international market, will even agree with this. And frankly, we believe it's extremely harmful if these nations don't participate in this ban because they are still taking from tax havens, meanwhile small developing countries and a few righteous developed countries don't. That's extremely dangerous. And there's no way their side of the house can recruit a nation like China into their fold, which is why we are extremely proud to oppose.
Past half an hour, all that I've corrected is the side opposition or a confused side. They come up here and they tell me that large countries like USA, UK, France also act as tax havens. So how would you blacklist them and how would you stop the global trade? But wait, then they also tell me that the very reason why smaller countries act as tax havens are because these very large countries imply high amount of taxes on its citizens. So ladies and gentlemen, a very simple question arises. How can a country be a tax haven in spite of the fact that it imposes large amount of taxes? Right? Why would a company go to another country which imposes a higher tax on you seeking better benefits? So they seem confused on this very point whether UK, USA, France actually constitute a tax haven or not. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you why they were faulted here. Now they talked about how, well, they seem to be completely intimidated by the United States of America. Like, if we stop trade with the United States of America, well, the world is going to end. Ladies and gentlemen, we also need to understand that United States of America also survives and is the superpower today that it is because it is trading with the numerous small nations that exist, because it is trading with the numerous so-called developing nations. And if these developing nations need to succeed, they need to understand that they need to work for their benefits. They told us that today developing nations cannot proceed if they are not tax havens. So in a way what they are saying that the majority of the world except the P5 should turn to tax havens only if they want to succeed. Otherwise, man, realize you're going to be a developing or an underdeveloped country for the remaining of future. So ladies and gentlemen, today side opposition did come up and only tell us that why tax havens might be illegal, but okay, we'll make them legal somehow, but still they'll give benefits to the developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, they need to realize that tax havens are nothing but parasites. They consider their benefits at the loss of another nation. They consider developing themselves at the loss of another nation's development. They are actually playing with another nation's development, and we cannot take that easily. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they failed to talk when we talked about money laundering and financing terrorism through tax havens. They did not talk about that. There was defining silence. They said, okay, we'll look into that, maybe we'll modify, we'll do something about it. But how would they be doing all this? How would they actually be changing tax havens into grey market? They just failed to implement. They need to realize that tax havens as of today are the biggest finances of terrorism, are the biggest ways through which money laundering takes place. And these are serious crimes, ladies and gentlemen, and we just cannot ignore them, saying that we will think out an implementation for them in the future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that they said what exactly tax havens are. Tax havens are regions that provide you with low taxes so that you migrate to their countries, and they provide you a financial secrecy from the world. They provide you a secrecy. They prevent your data from being given to the world. And ladies and gentlemen, how do we expect to live in a world where no one knows what others doing with his taxes, where no one knows what others doing with the finances he have? A very simple way, ladies and gentlemen, they are doing nothing but promoting yet again things like money laundering and financing terrorism. And this is the reason why we today are against tax havens and suggest of blacklisting them. They need to understand. They today provided tax havens as the only way out for developing nations. But ladies and gentlemen, understand that one tax havens takes up the spot of another developing nation.
30 seconds.
Yes, ma'am. So one tax havens takes up the spot of another developing nation. For the world to develop as a whole, only tax havens cannot survive. According to their plan, their theory, what they believe is that one nation remains a tax haven from developing, it changes to develop, then another nation which is still developing, it again takes up the chance of becoming a tax haven, and then it becomes developed. So the plan of development for the world is let's make each and every country a tax haven, and we'll have global development. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.